Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions, a podcast that takes an honest yet hopeful look at the things that the Church does in the name of missions. A podcast that seeks to inspire Christ followers to rethink the status quo of short-term missions and to forge a better way forward. We feature honest conversations with people from all over the world, those who go on mission trips and those who host them. And we don't shy away from tackling the hard and uncomfortable questions. Questions like, how can we learn about the history and culture of the people we go to serve? And even more importantly, how can we begin to build strong working relationships with our hosts before we go? How do we cultivate the humility among team members that helps us to work quietly alongside the people we visit, rather than assuming a role in the spotlight? Friends, there are better ways to love and serve the world, and it starts with courageous conversations. Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions. Hey friends, Forrest Inslee here, co-editor with Angel Burns of the book Reimagining Short-Term Missions. Recently, one of the book's contributors, Dr. Miriam Adeney, was interviewed on the Missions Drop podcast. Now, in this interesting conversation with Emily Simmons, Miriam shares about the importance of diversity and unity in the church. She pays particular attention to issues of race and ethnicity and talks about how those issues can have a huge impact on the effectiveness of mission efforts. The Missions Drop podcast has graciously allowed us to re-release this episode as part of the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast. But we encourage you to check out the Missions Drop podcast for many more interesting conversations all about missions. So, here's Emily.
While Miriam Adeney could do a podcast on a variety of subjects, today we invited her to share about hybrid ethnic identities and how these identities influence the way that we view people group missiology. Before we really get into the content, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. So what would you like our listeners to know about you, Dr. Adeney?
Well, I am a child of the Pacific Northwest, and I am passionate about trees and mountains and oceans, so ecology. And as an anthropologist, I think we need to notice people's material realities, which means sometimes hunger and sickness. So my first American book was subtitled Practical Ways to Help the World's Poor. But on a broader scale, I was raised in a home where my mom and my dad loved the Word of God and the world of God. And for myself, as I grew up, I fell in love with cultures and communication and the church. And so I ended up teaching and researching on 6 continents in areas like applied anthropology, women, world religions, ethnicity, diasporas, ethnotheology, and so forth, but especially communication. And I coach Christian writers in a variety of languages, working toward contextualized Christian communication, whatever the medium, whether print or digital or oral or whatever. And of course, I write. And I must say that my latest book, which is just out this month, is Afghan Mountain Faith, Stories of Justice, Beauty, and Relationships.
I received your email that book came out, and I'm very excited to read it. It sounds fascinating. And I also didn't know, as you just introduced yourself, that you're a lover of trees. I also am a lover of trees. I had no idea.
Well, I live in a forest. If you were here, you would see that I am just surrounded by trees. But I'm actually just back from Florida, where I was also appreciating the palm trees that you have.
Oh, nice. Yeah, Florida has a very different kind of tree to the rest of the United States. I guess California's got palm trees too, but
right.
So as usual, I would like to give our listeners a quick orientation to our topic before we really dive in. This episode is titled Hybrid Ethnic Identities. And as you heard from Dr. Adeney's introduction to herself, she has lots and lots of qualifications to talk about this topic. She's going to unpack this term for us in a moment, but some background is here at the Missions Drop podcast, we're committed to discussing barriers to frontier mission. What are the obstacles that prevent the gospel from having a ripple effect in peoples all around the world? So today we're really comparing how do people self-identify and describe themselves, and then how does the missions industry, how historically, how have they identified people groups? And then what barriers arise when those identification systems don't really match? So, Miriam, to start off, could you unpack the term hybrid ethnic identities for us?
Yeah. You have a hybrid identity when you are drawing from more than one cultural heritage, often because you migrated from one country to another, or because your dad and mom come from different backgrounds.
Gotcha. I've heard you talk about a connection between our modern pluralist society and then the dynamic nature of ethnic identity. Could you elaborate on that and the connection between those things for our listeners?
Yeah, well, yeah, ethnicity is and hybrid ethnicity are not fixed.
Mm.
Um, there is some fluidity, some dynamism that's potential, especially in modern plural society, but also in others. For example, here in the Pacific Northwest, we have
Hmm.
a number of families that are made up of Filipinos and Native Americans because when Filipinos migrated here in the 30s and 40s and 50s, sometimes there were barriers against them marrying Caucasian women. So they married Native Americans, and we have quite a few families like that. Now, if you take a family that Filipino, Native American that has three children, what is the ethnic identity of those three children?
Mm.
Well, one child might identify as a Native American. The second child might identify as a Filipino American. The third child might identify as just an American. But those identifications are not for all time because if the University of Washington offers scholarships to Native Americans, suddenly they are all Native Americans. Um, there is a dynamism. Now, you can't just have infinite choices. Obviously, I cannot say that I am Chinese. If I did, people would ask, well, were you adopted by a Chinese family or what? Because there's nothing that in my appearance or in my talk or anything else that indicates that I'm Chinese. I can't just select any old identification. But within certain range, often hybrid individuals do have some choices, and those choices can change over time.
Yeah, that's a really helpful unpacking of how our ethnic identity. There's some of it that's just given that we can't pick and choose, but then depending on what we're born with and born into, different situations might arise where we describe ourselves in one way versus another way in different contexts for different reasons. Yeah, you unpacked that really well. Thank you.
Mhm.
This next question will have a lot of words, but I'm going to ask you to stick with me. So, we've talked with previous guests before about people group missiology or people group theory, which is, for our listeners who are unfamiliar, it's the missiological strategy of establishing viable indigenous church movements in all cultures around the world. This isn't necessarily ethno-linguistic people groups, but that's often how it's applied functionally. And we've also had guests bring up the discussion about the homogenous unit principle, which is the idea that people will naturally form worshipful communities with people who are like them, and compare the homogenous unit principle with the multicultural church model, which is the belief that culturally diverse churches are healthier and more sustainable. So, all of that's just background for some of our listeners to define some of these terms. But my question for you, Dr. Adeney, is how does the concept of hybrid ethnic identities relate to these other concepts like people groups, homogenous units, and multicultural church model?
Well, that is a bunch of big words.
Right.
Obviously it's different for different people. Each person or each family, well, each person is in a distinct situation. But I believe that these concepts can be complementary.
Hmm.
I believe we should treasure our roots, and at the same time, we should network across cultures and be part of multicultural entities. Let me go back and talk about four ways that immigrants may connect with churches when they arrive in a place. One way is they arrive, let's say they're coming to the US. They arrive and they go to a mainstream church. They may not speak English well or much at all, or know American customs, but they just go and they worship. And people greet them, invite them to a few church activities, dinners, potlucks, so forth. And over time, they become a treasured member of that mainstream church. And by their presence, they make it a bit multicultural. Um, the second model, people come from another country, and when they get here, they recreate the church that they had back home in their own language, with their own styles of prayer, their gestures, their ways of making decisions, their time frame, their potlucks, all of that. Just like they did at home. It's familiar to them and comforting, and they really feel they can worship well in that way. The third model is people come and they start out maybe as a distinct ethnic church, but then over time, and maybe a generation or two later, they realize that if they are going to be authentic Christians and love their neighbors are not all like them. They have Black neighbors and white neighbors and Asian neighbors and Latino neighbors, and so in love they begin to reach out to their neighbors and welcome them into the church, and eventually point pastors that are from different backgrounds. For example, in Seattle, I think the Japanese Presbyterian Church has done a fairly good job of this. They still, however, have a Japanese emphasis. They celebrate Bon Odori, they celebrate cherry festivals, they have special rice festivals. They even have one service that is in the Japanese language because there are Japanese businessmen who come to the US and then go back home again, and their main language is Japanese. And so even if all the immigrants integrate and can speak English, there are more temporary people who benefit from the native language service. That's the third model. And then the fourth model would be people who are trying to rediscover their roots. For example, indigenous Native American Christians who maybe went through a period when they didn't do anything very Indian in their worship, but now they are integrating drums and powwows and processions and respect for the elders and orality and referring to God as creator and so forth. They're consciously reconnecting with their roots. And for some African Americans, that's also the case. They'll start wearing kente cloth and noting especially African American heroes and role models. And so these are four different kinds of ways that immigrants, I'm just taking immigrants as an example, may affiliate with the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, I personally favor a dual affiliation with roots in a heritage fellowship group and simultaneous immersion in a mainstream multicultural church. This, I think, is particularly valuable for families that have children growing up, because those children greatly benefit, I think, from being able to be part of the larger culture and being able to worship as Americans, as they are functioning as Americans in the English language in their schools and in their neighborhoods. They also need to be able to worship as Americans, but at the same time, they need to be able to continue to connect with their parents and their grandparents and their aunties and uncles and their heritage. And how good it is if there's a model that can affirm both of these ends, and in fact, maybe bring into the ethnic church some of the youth from the mainstream church who may find it interesting to join their friends in that heritage experience as well. That's the model that I favor, although, of course, different situations may call for different things.
Yeah, thank you for outlining those different approaches. I don't think I've ever heard it described that way. So that's really useful to think through, what does this look like when you try to merge two different backgrounds or one background into a new reality and to a new future. Something that you mentioned in your experience there in Seattle with the Japanese church and how they still, they're open to their neighbors who maybe are not Japanese, is what I think I heard you describe, but they still are encouraging a Japanese, like Japanese traditions that they can
Mhm.
use to celebrate Jesus and to be in
Mhm.
community together. That's a beautiful thing, and I'd love to
Mhm.
ask you, what does that do for the community in Seattle for those who are not Japanese? Is there a benefit to them being around those types of Japanese, or even taking part in those Japanese traditions with that church?
Well, yes, actually it likes diversity for the most part. So I think people very much appreciate um, uh, Christians
Hmm.
from Japanese heritage who continue to celebrate some of their distinctives. Yes, I think people find it enriching.
Yeah, I would love to experience something like that. And thankfully, I've had opportunities to be a part of worshipful experiences that maybe were, culturally very, very different from me, but something that it just revealed something new about people, about how God
Mhm.
created people in his image, and which therefore teaches me new things about God. And it's always just a really beautiful experience. So thanks for sharing that.
There are a lot of opportunities for mainstream churches to grow in this area because we are frankly surrounded by newcomers, refugees, and others who are coming into our society. And if we are meeting them and if they are willing to come to our churches, then it would be lovely if we could learn how to affirm their cultures or integrate their cultures. For example, I have an Afghan friend who is expecting a baby. So I asked some members of his church, because he goes to a regular church. I asked some members of his church, what do you do for babies? Well, they have a baby dedication at a certain time. Then I asked him, what does your culture do for babies? Well, the first day the baby is born, a religious leader comes and whispers the name of God into the baby's ear and recites some scripture into the baby's ear. And then 40 days later, they have a name celebration for the baby. Now, wouldn't it be lovely if the church could do that? And could do similar things for people of other cultures. It's very challenging. It's much easier to have racial integration than cultural integration in the church. That is challenging because then you've got people who have different ideas of being on time. People have different ideas about whether children should run around in the congregation. People have different ideas about whether you should have a meal after the service every single Sunday. People have different ideas about whether, when you're making a decision, you should plainly say what you think or whether you should speak indirectly. There are a lot of difficulties in cultural integration, but it also can be very rewarding.
Mm. I'm so glad you made that distinction of it can be easy to have I forget the word that you used, but racial diversity. It's a lot harder to do cultural diversity.
Racial.
Integration, that's what it was. Yeah, racial integration versus cultural integration. And now that you name that, I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. Of it's the worldview differences that we have as people who just grow up in very, very different ways and see the world in very, very different ways. That's a lot harder to reconcile and integrate within a congregation or within a church community. In your opinion, I'd love to ask, how would embracing hybrid ethnic identities, how encouraging this model where, you can pull from the different pieces of your background or from the different cultures around you, how would embracing that idea help to overcome barriers to understanding or accepting the gospel?
Well, hybrid identity is a reality for some of us or some of our neighbors. And so, if you really want to love that person, you have to love them in the complexity of who they are. And that's bringing the gospel to them, expressing the love of God by affirming the diverse parts of who they are.
Yeah, well said. I love that you've tied it back to love at the end of the day, that this is not just about this task, but it's how do we truly love people, and we have to love all of their pieces. We've talked about a couple different things here: plurality, diversity, homogeneity, unity. We've thrown around a lot of these words, and a lot of them are often labeled as good or bad. Unity is good, diversity is good, uniformity is bad, or the different labels that we give, healthy or unhealthy for a church. And the description that you've given of how to really embrace this hybrid ethnic identity, it's not necessarily labeling these things as good or bad, but taking people where they are and moving forward with that.
Well, I think that we are called to continually work for more unity and more diversity. I think that that's what God wants.
You've been listening to the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast. If you want to explore more diverse and challenging perspectives like this, check out Reimagining Short-Term Missions, which includes chapters written by our podcast guests and from many more STM innovators from around the world. Your podcast host is Forrest Inslee, co-editor of that book. Angel Burns is the book's co-editor, and our podcast producer is Heath Hollinsby. Friends, what we need now is nothing short of a revolution in short-term missions. So please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with others of like heart and mind. This is the time for reimagining short-term missions.